Hey, Web Unleashed. Yes, here we are. So yeah, very great honor. Thanks for the warm welcome. It's a keynote. I feel like sometimes keynotes have this like, love your sister, call your mother. I don't know, the past, the future, the vibe to them. But this is Canada, and everything is perfect here, so you don't need to know that stuff. We're just going to talk about CSS instead, which is cool because it's a web conference, and like CS, you don't really have a choice about using CSS on websites. So if you all care about websites, you automatically care about CSS. So let's talk about some kind of cool, newfangled-ish stuff in CSS. Specifically, we're going to talk about 4 properties. This is a grandiose title, A Tale of 4 Properties, whatever. We're just going to talk about 4 properties that are all kind of related to shapes in CSS. There's a whole bunch of stuff to talk about there that I personally find fascinating. So, those are those things I do. We already covered that. Let's just say, I'm beginning the tail now of this talk. Let's just say you really like the band They Might Be Giants. Yeah? Okay. Never heard of them? Whatever. Some people have. Kind of a nerd band. But particularly, you really like their 1990 seminal album, Flood. Maybe you even have it on cassette. It's the only album I have that has like its own like kind of like hype intro track on the beginning of it. It goes like this.
Why is the world in love again?
That was weird. It should have switched.
Why is the world in love?
You're doing a bad job. You need to. There's this whole thing where it does this ball bouncy. Maybe did I delete the slide? No. You're being weird. It was cool. It was just a cool part of the talk. Whatever.
Why is the world in love again? Why are we marching hand in hand?
Don't even worry
Why
about
are the ocean levels rising up? It's a brand new record for 1990. There might be Giants' brand new album, Flood.
That's an awesome way to start a record. That's so good. If you haven't heard of them or that, maybe they did have some songs that were like more popular, certainly than that intro track. Like this one got pretty popular for a hot minute.
I'm your only friend, I'm not your only friend, but I'm a little glowing friend, but really I'm not actually your friend, but I am. Blue canary in the alley by the light switch, who watches over you?
If you're as big of a fan as I am, you really only have one choice here. It's fan site time. We're going to build one. Stretch out. Get ready. It's the kind of thing you're supposed to be doing on a Monday morning or whatever day it is. What do you put on fan sites? I don't know. You get excited and you put lyrics and pictures and just stuff. Don't worry about it. I've mocked something up for us to basically go on that will get us going here. So let's do this, let's just focus on the lyrics for a minute. We're going to need some lyric pages for our fan site. There's another great song on this record called Particle Man that's just ripe for doing something sweet on this page. So Particle Man, it's like they like battle each other, different people. It's like,
Particle Man, doing the things a particle can.
Particle Man, he does things a particle can. So, like, I want to have a fan site, and I want to have all the lyrics on this song so other fans like me can come and, like, read the lyrics and just enjoy it and stuff. So I'm pretty sure this is how HTML works. You, like, put a a header tag on there, and then you go get the lyrics probably from somebody else's fan site, and you put them on yours, and you put paragraph tags around it and stuff. But now we're looking for some inspiration to do something sweet for our fan site. Like, we needed to design this sucker up, you know? We got the gradients going and stuff already. But what can we do special for Particle Man? Like, for inspiration, maybe we'll look to Triangle Man. In the song, Triangle Man tends to win. I don't know, it doesn't exactly describe who the winner of this song is, but I'm pretty sure it's Triangle Man.
Triangle Man, Triangle Man, Triangle Man hates Particle Man. They have a fight, Triangle wins, Triangle Man.
Anyway, Triangle Man usually wins. In fact, every fight he's in this song, Triangle Man wins. So, like, let's pay homage to Triangle Man somehow. So maybe we'll set those lyrics, but we'll set them at like a slant. Because, for Triangle Man, like this. Like, can we set text like that somehow on the web? Here's one way you can do that on the web. Just rock it out, pretext. Just keep those spaces in there. That should work fine. That's got the spirit we're looking for, I think, in a fan site. But let's see if there's another way to do it. In fact, there is. In CSS, there's a new property we can look at. Have you heard of floats? They're new. But this is what floats do. You can have an element, and you can just stick it there, and its display block automatically, because it's display float, or float has a float property. It's automatically display block, so it has this block dimensions, and anything that's in line around it of any variety, the text will float around it. So that's what floats do. That's what they're designed to do. That's what we can do. There's this new-ish property in CSS that allows us to kind of re-describe how we want the text to flow around that floated element, which is a little bit weird, but we'll get there. So here's our floated element. Float left, height and width. Now check this out. There's this new property, shape outside, that kind of like is like, okay, I see what you're going to do. You're going to, kind of redefine the shape of that element, at least where you want the text to flow. The element itself just hangs out there where it was, but we're going to redefine where we want the text to flow. And so we can give that a bunch of different values. Here's one of the values you can give it, polygon, and that's what's extra super fascinating to me. What? Polygon as a value in CSS as a function? Like, shape outside is cool, and we're going to look at that, but I think this is even more cool that we can just define a poly. We can just draw coordinates in CSS. That's cool. So we can give it this comma-separated list of values, as many values as you want, and it's basically going to draw a straight line to that. So 100, 0, that's up there at the top. 200, 200 down there at the bottom right corner of the element itself. 0, 200, and we've made a triangle. And once that's done, this is what happens to the text. It comes over and hangs out. We can totally do slanted text that easily now, which is cool. So shape outside is kind of like chipping away at a floating element. And when I wrote that, I was like, that's kind of not right, because it doesn't actually really matter the size of the original element. It's more like redefining that element. That triangle could have been way bigger than the original element. It doesn't matter. It's just, here's a new shape, and I want the text to float around that new shape that I'm defining. And in this case, I used Polygon to do it. So if I want to, on our fan site, if I want to do this thing and like have all the text tilted, we'd have a triangle that's like 100% high, or 100% is the page, because you can use those too. We used pixels in that example, but it takes relative units, it takes percentages, it takes whatever you want to give it. And now I can set all of our awesome Particle Man stuff that way, which is fantastic. And because CSS kind of likes numbers and generally is cool about allowing us to animate numbers, that's the case here, and we can animate it. So in this example, I have it not slanted, but I have a button wired up to it where if you click it, ooh, it like slides that thing in. That is a fancy feature for a fan site. So this is how that works. I said, okay, that floated element has a transition on it, and that it's going to transition the shape outside over 2 seconds with an easing thing on it. And then I have two classes, one off and one on. I'm doing that on purpose to just kind of help the animation a little bit. So when it's off, it makes a polygon that's basically 0 width. So from 0, 0 to 0 to 100 and then stay there and go back. It won't do nothing. That off class is nothing. But it's setting itself up so that the on class can slide out one of those points and animate it. Those two properties right there are animatable because they're both a polygon and they both have the same number of points. So CSS is like, cool, I can animate that. You can animate other shape outside features too. This is just wired up to move an element around, but also move the shape outside property at the same time. So it's like, it's happy to, that's just JavaScript doing that. But we'll look more at this in just a second. We got to do Universe Man too. He also appears in the famous song Particle Man by They Might Be Giants' 1990 seminal album Flood. Universe Man is a big fat dude. So maybe, just like Triangle Man, he'll smash his big fat belly up against the text. That would be cool feature for a fan site that we're building. Tiny Toons once made a video that they played on Tiny Toons of Particle Man, which is great. And this is what he looks like. He's a big fat dude. So let's make him smash his belly all up in that text.
Universe man, size of the entire universe, man. Usually kind to smaller man.
Whatever, he's a big round thing. Shape outside, we just looked at polygon, which is like, give me this point and this point and this point, and draw straight lines between them. That's what a polygon is. It takes other functions as well. It doesn't need to be a polygon. It could be a circle or an ellipse, and they have their own little mini syntaxes as well. Let's look at ellipse a little bit. We're going to have this shape, and we'll have universe off and universe on. Universe off defines basically a circle. We're just using ellipse, so it's 200 wide, 200 tall circle. And then where is the circle? It's at negative 300 as a y value. So it's just moved to nowheresville. It will do nothing, that off class. And then on moves the location of that circle down. So this is what's happening. There's this big floated element, whatever, but it's kind of been collapsed to nothing because we've moved that circle to nowheresville and define that. When it comes on, the shape outside comes in and it will move the text like that around the circle. And look at what happens when you actually use it. First we got Triangle Man, which we have the animation set up for. Then if I click Universe Man, it will transition Triangle Man off and then boo! Nice. You can turn them on and off. Big fat belly comes sliding in. That's kind of amazing that you can do that in CSS. I think that's just cool. Not an everyday kind of thing, but certainly cool for a fan site. This is just a little JavaScript that the point of which is not a big deal, but it's basically like you can't transition a polygon to an ellipse. If you try to do that instead of transition in CSS, you're going to be disappointed. CSS doesn't know how to transition a polygon to an ellipse. It just won't do it. It'll just instantly change from one to the other. Even a polygon with different number of points it can't deal with. So even if it can morph a polygon to a different polygon as long as it has the same number of points. So all this is doing is like, well, okay, you can't transition one to the other, but we'll transition you off, then rip off that class, then put the new off Universe Man off class on there, and then when it's done with that, slap the Universe Man on class on there, and it can transition to itself, whatever. It's just like trickery because I wanted to make sure you could click these buttons and have that thing happen. So this is just some elaborate class manipulation to make sure that you can do that. So all that stuff was super cheesy, but there's actually some kind of classy stuff you can do with shape outside. For example, this is Stacy Kvernmo, who, I think that's even her. She's kind of a gymnast and set some text with her own body doing a cool shape thing into that text. So that's the kind of thing that you can do with shape outside. I think is neat. Jen Simmons talks a lot about cool layout stuff that you can do. Back in 2016, made a bunch of demos of the same kind of thing, of like fruit, that was a circle, that's an ellipse. This is a polygon with dots kind of following the grapes along the outside. You can cut right through the text if you want to. It'll figure out what to do there. Works in multi-column layouts. Well, most of the demos are always float left. This one happens to be float right with a bunch of little images there. Just proving, open your mind, all kinds of weird stuff can happen. You can even say shape outside and give it a raster image, and it will do some edge detection, believe it or not, around that image. So this is Sarah Swadan for the Code Drops CSS reference in which the text is like wrapping around this swan, and it's just kind of figured out how to do that by itself by looking at the swan. So you can see me selecting the text, and that there's no special code that defines that polygon. Even DevTools is showing me the edge detection that is done to figure that out, which is kind of cool. It's based on a threshold value that you give it. So maybe we'll do Person Man, too. He's up in the song Particle Man. What should we do for Person Man? Maybe we'll just come up with, do some real simple, like, SVG icon of a person. Now look at that. You know, you can see the vector handles there that looks like Illustrator, kind of. Unfortunately, that might not work. So let's look at this for a minute. It's going to end up being path data. You know, we have polygons, we have circles, ellipses, but that thing, that was a path, and we're going to get into that in a minute. So shape outside, that's what we've looked at so far. It takes that polygon syntax, we looked at that. It takes circles, it takes ellipses, we looked at that. We didn't look at inset, we will in a minute, but that's a function, that's a value that it can take. It cannot take path, it cannot take path data, which is a little too bad. So that arm of Person Man, we just basically couldn't do it. We couldn't use that data. It's not available to us at shape outside, which is a little weird. Well, we can give it a URL, but the URL is to a raster image. So remember the swan that we just looked at there. So that's the kind of browser support situation for that. It's not talking about what browser support. It's talking about if the browser supports it, which pairings of value and property does it take? Yeah, so Person Man, we want to do that. That's going to require a path. Doesn't work. And that's just assuming that the browser supports. So of browser support for shape outside and that stuff above, you're looking at the kind of the classic party. That's Android, you know, iOS on both mobile and desktop. Firefox works. It's really just Edge and then Opera Mini, which is fine because I don't even think Opera Mini should support weird stuff like this probably. It's kind of not the point. So pretty good browser support overall, but it's not even the browser support for shape outside that I care about. I'm more interested in kind of once the browser does support it, this like nuanced middle tier of support. So with Person Man, like those grapes or whatever, you could fake it with straight edged lines connected by points. It wouldn't be so bad to fake Person Man with just a bunch of polygon points. Like we could do that, but let's just wait on that for a second. That's what fancy people say at dinner parties. Let's put a pin in that. Because we got to deal with Particle Man. It's his song. He needs to be flying all around that thing. Woo! Particle Man, of course. That's how he wins matches, by being small and limber and quick. So if he's going to be flying all around this page, I have roughly charted this course for him. I want to have Particle Man on our fan site, and he's got to be flying around, and he's going to fly around like that. So, like, back to our pin, we can't have a polygon. We can't fake that with a polygon. It'll be jerking around on the page. No, I need fluid motion action for Particle Man. I demand it. Fortunately, there's the second property we're going to look at today that's all over this called offset path. New thing-ish in CSS. Actually, it used to be called motion path, which made a little bit more sense.
Why they changed it, I can't say. People just liked it better that way.
They don't like it better that way. Offset path is stupid. They're like, well, we could, but you know, you could define a path, but then never move it along that path. So we shouldn't call it motion path because you might not animate it. You could just define the path. So let's just call it offset path instead of motion path because you might not animate it. I'm like, why would you define a path for movement and then not use it? You know, it's like we shouldn't call it margin, you know, like we might not use it to space elements out. We might just use it because those two elements hate each other. So, I don't know, I think stuff like that is weird. So anyway, old syntax, motion path, it's actually called offset path now, and there's a path function, so it's not, like even though shape outside didn't take it, offset path does, and it's called path with parentheses around it, and then you give it path data, and that stuff looks weird, but it is actually kind of human parsable. You see the M in there. M means like move to the coordinates 5, 5, and then move relative to that, -4, 0, and then draw a curve. A is one of the curve commands that does this. It's like, you know, it's weird, but it makes sense in a weird way. The point being, paths are awesome. Paths are amazing. Paths can draw circles and ellipses and polygons. Paths can do all that stuff, but they can draw curves. There's no limit to what paths can do. So it's like, if you're going to support anything, you should support paths. Paths are the best. They come from SVG. There's a D attribute, which is just like data, and then it takes this string. And it works like this. Like, you know, like I said, move to the coordinate 25, 100, then draw another point at the point 75, 100, but draw two Bezier curves before, or two Bezier points before that, and the curve will be informed by those points. And there's all kinds of different commands. All those letters and stuff in paths mean something. Like it's this type of curve, and it can draw anything, and it's great. So if I draw that, which I literally did draw that in an online free SVG editor called Method Draw, I just took the pen tool and I just drew some crazy path around. And if I select that, you can see all the vector point data and stuff. If I save that SVG file out, there'll be a path there with a D attribute and all those values, the M's and the D's and the A's and all that draw that thing. I can just lift that value, that D value, and plop it into CSS. Offset path, and then there's the path, and then with the quoted string and all that. And then I am going to animate it. I'm going to use a keyframes animation and say, do it over and over again, do it over 3 seconds, have a boring linear curve to it, and animate that motion offset, which is the property that's paired with it, to 100%. So it will go from 0 to 100% just over and over and over and over. And this is what it's going to look like in CSS. So that little speck is flying around. Let me make it a little, slow it down. Maybe that'll be easier to see. I'll bump it up the size in case you can't see that. Oh, and you can see how it's like curving too. It's like it's changing its rotation to match the curve, which is an interesting thing it can do. So if I made it into a car, you could see that going on, which is useful. I'm going really slow around there. Sometimes it's useful. Sometimes you want that. Sometimes it doesn't matter. It kind of depends. So here's another example of where it might matter. So in a practical world, maybe like, have you seen those cool, like this dialog box is going to appear, it's going to slide in from the top, or like be blurry and then just appear out of the ether or whatever. Like, why not have it follow a cool path on its way in? So that's an example of that. It's just following a little curved path on its way in. If we remove offset rotation, it's going to follow the curve. So that's a little awkward. So we're overriding that and saying, don't do that behavior, that auto behavior. Just come in normal style, Fantastic. So cool. Particle man, whatever, you can click it, and we just may have had it like kind of appear and fade out with scale. So fan page, looking good. Wired up some buttons that we can click to do this stuff. Here's a weird thing, though. This offset path, that thing we just looked at that made Particle Man fly around, it only takes path as a value, which is a little weird because you're like, what if I want to animate something in a circle? Why can't I use circle? Clearly, circle as a command already exists, so it's a little WTF-y, I think. But it makes sense in a little bit of a way, in that one's called offset path, so it's like, I get it, it takes path. And the other thing is, like, if I define a circle, which way on the circle? Like you could go this way or this way. And there's just no way to, I think spec authors were like, let's punt on that. Paths have an inherent direction. You can draw the circle this way or draw it that way, and direction is kind of inherently part of path. So it makes sense a little bit of a way. But if we're comparing those two properties, shape outside, we already looked at that as compared to path. It does and doesn't take all those things. Like, they seem related. They seem like I need to draw a shape and then use that shape. And then it's a total flip-flop for path. It does take path, but shape outside doesn't. Cool. And then shape outside takes a URL. Remember the swan or whatever? An offset path doesn't take any URL at all, which is too bad, because it probably should be able, as we'll see in a minute, it probably should be able to point to an existing SVG path on there by ID and animate along. And it could stand to reason that there'd be an SVG shape somewhere that you'd want to animate something along. You should be able to do that probably, but you can't, not just yet. Just like there's actually tasteful things that you could do with shape outside, there's some tasteful things you can do with offset path too. Of course there are. There's lots of stuff. Here, Rachel McGrain made this lovely little loader thing. Whoa. God, I love stuff like that. This one is particularly cool because there's some randomized data in the path that it generates there. You can see in the JavaScript it's just using some random numbers to generate the path, which ultimately gets done by CSS. So all these little hearts that fly out of there It's not the same every time. It's randomized each time it's clicked to be slightly different in how it works, which is a lovely little demo. I thought this one was fun by Dan Wilson, who's been doing research on this path stuff a lot. This is just a fun trick he put together. We put a bunch of different objects on the same path, and then it's like, what shape am I drawing? You guess it. And it's hard to guess until you get them moving faster, and then you can kind of guess, although we are in Canada. Is that shape obvious in Canada? It's Texas. Yeah. Cool. But that's a fun demo. Anyway, so let's move on here. Let's do some more fun stuff on a fan page. I feel like any good fan page should have some weird reveals, some surprising hover effects and stuff like that. So, what should we do with that? They have a song called "Your Racist Friend" that's pretty good.
I know politics for you, but I feel like a hypocrite talking to you and your racist friend.
It's a sweet song, but it's just about being bummed out by going to a party where you have to talk to somebody and the friend is racist and you're like, I don't want to be here at all. So anyway, let's say we have you as a graphic. First, obviously, we set the text in some cool way on our fan site. And then we have a picture of you and your racist friend. and then we're going to reveal that. So when you hover over you, it reveals your racist friend. And we can do that with clip path in CSS. So, for example, remember in Shape Outside, we had polygon, we have circle, we had ellipse, and all that stuff. Those same functions work with clip path too, which used to be called clip. Clip path is the new good way to do this. There's another one that we didn't look at called inset. So inset is an element, and an element has its dimensions, right? An inset takes 4 values and it says, I'm just going to push in from the outsides of that element. How far from the top, how far from the right, how far from the bottom, how far from the left. That's what's going on here. So if I want to take an element of any kind, it could be an image, but it could be a div or a span or whatever. Push in from that. So this is only going to reveal visually that part that I haven't yet pushed to with the inset function. And that's animatable as well. It's just 4 numbers. CSS is happy to animate that for us. So I have a transition property on that for all properties. And I'm also going to move it X-wise a little bit. So in this demo, it's just as simple as that. You're hovering over this, and it's the clip. It's not the coolest demo, but it's just the clip path is animating. It could have just slid in from the edge of the page or whatever, but I was just like, I don't know, let's put it down here. It's a fan site. Don't think too hard about it. So just like you can do tasteful stuff with all those other properties, there's plenty of tasteful stuff you can do with clip path too. In fact, I find it probably the most practical of all of them. This is just another fake site I put together for a fictional gym in which I stacked these coach divs on top of each other, and they're clipped to that kind of a weird section of the image, and then as you hover over it, the inset animates to 0, 0, 0, 0. It's not clipped at all anymore. So it's the kind of thing that you'd have to implementation detail-wise, you'd have to do a good job. You'd probably wrap this in a media course or pointer course. You know what I'm talking about? I know that was very vague. I'm sorry, but there's a media query that says you got a mouse, and if you do, then you would put this, and if that media query isn't true, you'd probably be like, well, they don't have a mouse, so there's no way they have hover, so this isn't a very good interaction because there's no way for them to get at that information. So you have to be careful with how you do it. Maybe you'd wrap it to a click handler or whatever. However you reveal it. I was mostly focusing on the CSS part of this, kind of oh, cool, you can make that happen. And it's kind of cool how that div, if we're looking at her arm with the rope, and then just to the left of it is just white space, right? As you hover over it, you're technically that div is z-index stacked on top of everything else, because as you can see, as we hover over it, it reveals everything, but it clips the mouse events away too. So if something's clipped away, even if you're mousing over it, it kind of pretends like it's not there. So stacking-wise, it's kind of an interesting thing. This is just a really simple demo, but you can see how percentages work. So you have some section element, and you have ample padding on the sides of it. So you just slice a little bit off the top and slice a little bit off that bottom to make kind of an angled element. That's kind of a weird, cool-looking effect in the web. The web is so full of damn rectangles. Once in a while, it's cool to see something that isn't a rectangle. Animation-wise, Clip path is animatable as well. Here's some percentages of some circles that just are clipped at a polygon on the sides of it and repeated over and over. It's shimmy, shimmy, shaking with the keyframe. Why not? You can totally do that in CSS. Social media has decided that all avatars will be round now, forever. So, why not ellipses? Why not little speech bubbles and stuff? Clip path is perfect for that kind of thing. If you're just making a circle, certainly border radius is the way to go. But if you need to make an ellipse, I think border radius can do that too, actually. But if you need to make that thing on the right, you definitely need clip path and give it some polygon values to make that little speech bubble, which is kind of a cool effect. It's okay to crop user avatars now, we've been told. Animatable as well, even with easing. So this has kind of a bouncy cubic Bezier easing on it, which I think is especially amazing. Oh, it's kind of a little bit of a choppy video. But the choppiness is kind of interesting. It's actually pretty smooth on my machine, this animation, but I don't know that it's like one of those hardware animated things. I could be wrong about that, but I don't think you can count on it for like 60 FPS or whatever. This is clip path being used in kind of a funny way. It's just tied to JavaScript, so it's still CSS doing the clip pathing action there, but the center of the clip path is just being moved around with the mouse position a little bit, and it's being determined like, hey, which box is it in? Maybe animated a little, just slightly bigger and stuff. So it's like the basics, and then if you go just beyond the basics, usually this animation stuff, that's when it gets cool, I like this. Anyway, a bunch of cards stacked on top of each other, and it clip paths the next one to reveal the next slider, depending on which one is active at any given time. It's really actually pretty simple, not much code at all to do that kind of thing with clip path. Which slide is active? Well, clip the one above it. This is a fantastic tool for all the shape outside stuff and the clip path stuff that take the functions circle, ellipse, polygon, and inset. This tool is called Clippy, so if you're going to Google for it, you got to get up past this Microsoft crap, and then there's a tool that'll say Bennett Feely Clippy or whatever, and this tool's amazing. It has great tools for, I wonder if, is this a video? God, good job, self. It has all this, I need to describe, it just gives you the code at the bottom. The best tool being the make your own polygon one, where you can kind of just click around on the little example element it gives you. And of course, it's using an image here, but again, it doesn't have to be an image. It can be any element at all. You can drag those points around and stuff. And then it gives you percentage values below to use, which percentages are probably the most practical and useful of the value units you can use for something like clip path and the polygon function. Rad! Guess what? No path. You want to clip something with freaking curves? Too bad. I hate that. So, shape outside and clip path are similar in that they all support all of those functions, the circle, the polygon, the ellipse, and the inset. An offset path doesn't. And then it's the exact opposite story, again, with offset path, which only takes path. And then how URL works is different. So clip path can have a URL that points to some inline SVG. If you had an SVG element sitting there and it had a path defined and it had an ID on it, you could say the clip path should match that ID, and then it would allow a curve because the ID could be on a path that does have curves. So, but it's totally different than how URL works for shape outside, which only points to raster graphics. Weird. Those are the sad things, which we'll get to in another second here. So there are ways to get curved clipping paths. If you have like an image and you want, person man or whatever there that clearly is path data that you need to clip, you can do that. Number one is to point to an existing SVG element that's on the page that's just like doing nothing else. It's just sitting there waiting for it to be used in CSS to clip something out, or use the mask property in CSS, which allows you to point to a raster graphic. Anywhere that's like white is revealed and black is hidden or whatever in the graphic, and grays are in between. That's what mask does. Clipping paths are you're either in or you're out. Masks are you're in or you're out, or it's gray, and it's partially transparent. So here's a straight-up black and white graphic. I have an Illustrator on the right. And as a matter of fact, the black area in this is going to be what's revealed. That's how masks work. So I have this hosted online. You can see here, I brought it up in my browser so you can see the graphic is hosted. And if I set the background image to mask image, You can see what's happening there and that it masks that. And I can use the mask size property to change how big it is. In fact, I can say 100%, I think, and it will cover that area with that shape, or even cover a keyword. And it's vector, so it will scale nicely. If that heart was humongous, it would scale nicely. It wouldn't be like jagged edges on the outside or anything like that. So Tim Holman made this demo of like a slide deck. So this just says like this little piggy, but of course it could be any content full of stuff. And he has he hooked it up to the keyboard so that you can change slides by just going backward and forward or whatever. And it's using the mask image property and animating the mask size to go to the next slide, like that clip slider. He put the donkey in there, so he called it an ass wipe. But there's the mustache, which proves that you can clip with a curve if you need to with mask. So, SVG, we've mentioned it a bunch. It's kind of like, this talk was an extension of mine because I talk about SVG a lot because I think it's super cool. It's kind of like, well, number one, you should buy this book. It's called Practical SVG. You should buy it immediately. It's by some genius author. And I talk about SVG because it's like the bad mother flipper of graphics formats. It's the graphics format that says bad mother flipper on it. Cool. So SVG is like we talked about masking and clipping and that type of stuff is like, oh, it's cool that you can do it in CSS. And it is cool that you can do it in CSS. You can just do way more with SVG than that. So SVG, it can't wrap text anyway, so it's a little relevant to shape outside. But with clip path, a clip path in SVG can be elaborate and reference multiple shapes with blending and turbulence filters, and it can do all kinds of weird stuff that CSS could only dream of. So if you're really interested in this stuff, SVG is the way to go. And that motion along a path stuff that CSS can do there, the browser support for that ain't particularly great. It's actually a little bit better for SVG Smile, but only kind of temporary. And I say Smile is like this subset of SVG that has like interaction features and things like animate motion in it, which is animating something along a path. It's just a little dangerous. I try not to talk about Smile because the Blink team has said, like, we're going to chop this. And Edge is like, we're never going to support this ever. So it's just not something that I would recommend digging into a whole bunch, but the fact that that's kind of the future of things like Smile, I think that's probably why, in the popularity of SVG at all, is driving some of this. We should get some of this into CSS before we actually chop it. That way, you can't be mad at us. We made another way for you to do those same things. For example, take a look at this. So I have the Noun Project Mac app open here. I have it in SVG format. I can just drag something into CodePen there, and it will just grab that code and have it available. Let me just target that first path. I'm going to use a little background red, driven development, make sure I have targeted what I think I have targeted. Cool. So I have control over that SVG element from CSS. Look at that. You could do that. D is a property that you can get your hands on right in CSS. If I give it an empty path, it disappears because I've redefined that path in CSS, so it's just gone. But if I take that, the path data that was already there, it's back. And now I can change those values, like I scooted it over to the left by changing that one value a little bit. Or I could make it taller. V's like move down from where you were before, the lowercase v. So, but I could also do, because I'm in CSS, I have interactive possibilities. So I can say when you hover over the SVG entirely, then make yourself longer. That's pretty cool. So now I'm controlling an interactive feature of the drawing of the shape itself. If I give that a transition, look at that. Now I'm morphing the shape, essentially, with a hover effect, which is pretty cool. God, it's amazing that we have that kind of control in CSS now. Here's some really simple SVG drawings of just like demonstrating a straight line, a multi-part straight line, how the different curves work. Look at how little code it takes to draw those. And I can just say, draw yourself with a thick stroke, draw yourself pretty big with rounded end caps in CSS. So I have these tiny, tiny amount of code to draw those shapes. And at the same time, I can say, and this is just me proving that that's the case. So I'm changing it to 1, 1 there, and you can see it stretch out towards the upper left instead of 2, 2. And then in CSS, I'm going to be like, okay, on hover, I'm going to redefine what those shapes are. I'm going to say, instead of you starting at the upper left, why don't you start at the upper right at 8, 2 instead? So as I hover over it with a transition, all that's possible. Just a tiny, 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 tiny amount of code. think it's a pretty kind of compelling thing you can do in browsers now. But notice the function, path, with parentheses on the outside of it. It takes path. God dang it. Oh, anyway, I put those on this page for the song We Want to Rock for They Might Be Giants, which is just, it's kind of confusing. I don't even really remember what we were talking about.
Where was I forgot the point that I was making. I said if I was smart that I would save up for a piece of string and a rock to wind the string around. Everybody wants a rock to wind a piece of string around.
Everybody wants a rock to wind a piece of string around. So path in SVG, I can control that path. We just looked at that with the D thing. What about polygons? Can you do it with polygons? No. Even though Polygon is supported all kinds of everywhere else, that's not possible for some reason. What about, so is it just path, or what about the rest of the SVG elements? All the rest of the SVG elements are possible as well. You can control all of their values right through CSS. WTF, why you can't do it with Polygon? Blows my mind. I have no idea why. Anyway, so I'll spare you the animations on this chart. It's not like path is all alone with offset path and its support. It also works on the D property. So it's like path is there, it works. So anyway, this chart I think is just weird. And this is in browsers that already support all this stuff. So it would be weird. This is mostly just for, like, in case somebody here is from a browser vendor or something, here's my wish list. Shape outside should be able to use path. That would be nice to have curves in there. It should also be able to point to an existing SVG fragment like it can't now. It would be nice to know if path is going to stay how it is, because there's been talk that they're going to remove the path function and just make it quoted instead or something like that. And the fact that this is as weird as it all is because path, you'd notice all those numbers in the path index didn't have pixels or rems or percentages or anything. It's just unitless values. That's because unitless makes sense in SVG land, but it doesn't really make sense in CSS land. So, like, what are they going to do about that? That's a pretty weird situation to be in, and that's going to affect all of this going forward. And all that polygon mismatch stuff is really quite weird. But anyway, word on the street is that I was literally walking down the street talking with a spec person about all this, and they're like, we're gonna rein that all in. So I'm like, good, thanks. I'll update my talk when you do. Get on it. And I should also point out that really all of that stuff falls into that progressive enhancement stuff where it's just like, oh, well, my particle man doesn't fly around. So what? My modal doesn't fly in on a path. Who cares? My text doesn't wrap around my cool gymnast move. It doesn't matter. Like, all this stuff is kind of just sugar, which is cool. And untapped, rather. Like, I think there's just a lot of cool stuff you can do with all these 4 properties that we talked about that hasn't been explored all that much. I really recommend looking around if you're compelled by this thing. There's only so many demos I can show in 45 minutes, but CodePen is absolutely packed to the gills with demos on this kind of thing. Just search for the property and you'll get a zillion demos of compelling things that you can do with that. Anyway, thanks for listening to my talk about properties.
There's only one thing that I know how to do well, and I've often been told that you only can do what you know how to do well, and that's be you. Be what you're like. Be like yourself. And so I'm having a wonderful time, but I'd rather be whistling in the dark.
Be like yourself. Be cool. Bye.